Hey everybody, it's Tracy, and I get a lot of inquiries about high-risk merchant processors. And high risk, or what makes you high risk, is typically the industry that you're involved in. So, like crypto, payments, gaming, adult, you know, telemarketing of any nature, nutraceuticals are on the list. It's crazy. And there's other factors that obviously like weigh into it. And, the whole concept of deeming an entity high risk is the risk of chargebacks, right? And so those industries that I mentioned, I guess have higher rates of chargeback, typically higher than 0.9% of all transactions. That is the industry standard. So you have that. There's some other things that can factor into it, like if you have, if you're international, multiple currencies, just higher volume. If your ticket size is over 500, that could put you at high risk. And it's kind of, there's no bright line rule, but that's kind of how you fall into it. So, the question is like, how do I find one and how do I know who I'm working with? And like, number one, overwhelmingly, when you like Google it, you're going to find just brokers, right? And they're going to tack something on top of what the rate is. And like for high risk, it's typically 0.15, 1.5 and higher, right? Depending on like your risk profile. And, you may also have to look at like a reserve, right? And there's three types. One is an upfront reserve, where you have to simply pay an amount of money when you start working with them to cover potential chargebacks or losses. There's a rolling reserve, which takes an additional percentage of each transaction, holds it for some unspecified period of time, and then releases it. And then there's the fixed reserve, which basically there's a percentage of each transaction up to a certain amount, and that just sort of stays there. So that's kind of how like the lay of the land works, right? And when you're trying to find, if you can get to the actual source, right? Like, and the brokers are helpful, like obviously I broker it, but a lot are just kind of like shills for like one outfit. And it all kind of comes back to some of the larger ones, that you find out there. So you kind of have to look. And I always like the regulatory background of the high risk processor. So like in the States, absent the states that have not adopted agent of payee exemption, there's like 30, you need a money transmission license. Outside of the US, like in the EU, it's kind of universal that you need like an EMI or payments license. And then you kind of have like the offshore, right, with Mauritius and places like that. And, I never say don't stay away from them because, ultimately they have relationships with the card networks, right? So there's some due diligence, but you also have to think about who their financial partners are, because obviously they're not a bank, right? Like they're just acting as an intermediary and like rerouting the money, but that involves the involvement of a licensed financial institution. And so, you have to look at those offshore operators with a little more caution than you would in the US or EU, because you can find a larger bank that'll take the risk, right? And you may not with a Mauritius license. But again, the relationship with the card network and all that kind of alleviates some of it, because somebody somewhere did some due diligence, else they really couldn't operate and take, your Visa or MasterCard. So that's part of it, right? And you hear a lot of horror stories like like with CC Bill, right, which is one of the big ones, where they just like withhold, without any sort of like fore notice or anything like that, money that has been processed. And if you get into the details of like the nuts and bolts of the agreement that you sign with these high risk processors, they almost all say that, right? That like with very little, certainty, and it's almost totally ambiguous, they can just elect to withhold funds that otherwise should have been deposited. So that's something you're going to contend with, and people will, I've had people reach out to me and they'll say, well, they've got $50,000 and they won't give it back. Well, there's really nothing you can do about it, right? Like, they can't keep it forever, but they can keep it for quite a while because you signed an agreement that said they could. So, and, if you're using like an offshore processor, to go back to that, at the end of the day, what are you going to do? Sue them in Mauritius, right? Like, so it really doesn't behoove you. Maybe you don't use them, right? But it doesn't behoove you to sort of like go ballistic and all that, because then they really have no inclination or need to give you back your money. Like, simply, I wouldn't run transactions through it. I'd just find another processor, because that way, once the risk of chargeback clears, then they have no real reason to hold the money. And, reputation does matter some. So that's, generally speaking, high risk processing and how to find it, and how to kind of select, who to use. But, if you're in a high risk industry and have questions and need an introduction, definitely hit me up. Adam at adamtracy.io, and I'll talk to you next time. Cheers.